Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Bustamante. In this video, we're going to do the second half of 8.2, which is energy flow through ecosystems. We kind of talked about food webs, food chains in our other video. In this video, we're going to talk more specifically about kind of how individual organisms use energy and how it helps them. So the first thing I want to talk about is that organisms use energy, right, to do lots of things, to maintain organization, to grow and reproduce. And one of the things they have to do to maintain homeostasis, right, this balance, is really just their body temperature. And there are two types of organisms I want to talk about. There are endotherms and exotherms. Now, endotherms, what can they do? They can basically regulate their own body temperature. Sometimes you'll hear these called warm-blooded organisms. So that's like you and me, right? We can regulate our body temperature, right? It doesn't matter what temperature it is outside, we can keep our body temperature about the same, right? Due to our ability to metabolize things, right? And maintain homeostatic body temperature. Ectotherms, on the other hand, lack efficient, what we say, internal mechanisms for maintaining body temperature, right? So they aren't able to control their own body temperature. So what does that mean? That means they either have to move into a different environment, maybe into the sun or into the shade. If they get too hot or too cool, maybe they have to move a lot. Maybe they have to group together in order to maintain a body temperature that is functional for them. In other words, they kind of change temperature with their environment, right? They take on the temperature that is around them. Sometimes you'll hear these called cold-blooded animals. These tend to be things like fish, amphibians, reptiles, invertebrates, right? So how we use that energy in organisms can be different a little bit to maintain homeostasis in body temperature, right? And there are different types of organisms, endotherms and exotherms, and they're able to do that differently. Next, I want to talk a little bit about metabolic rates, right? A metabolic rate is really just the amount of energy expended by an animal for a specific period of time, and we call it this metabolic rate. Smaller organisms actually tend to have faster metabolic rates than bigger organisms, which seems kind of backwards, right? But if we look at this graph, here's our metabolic rate, and here's our mass of our organism, and we'll notice that small things like a mouse, all these different kind of mice, are different than an elephant or even a horse, sheep, dog, cat that are down here, right? Well, why is this? This deals with the same idea as when we were talking about surface area and volume in, say, cells, right? Smaller organisms have a higher surface area to volume ratio. So that means that small animals tend to have more body surface relative to their volume of metabolizing tissue. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that small animals tend to actually lose heat to cooler environments faster than larger animals do. And because of this, smaller animals need more energy and a higher metabolic rate in order to maintain a constant internal temperature in their body. They have to be able to process energy, if you will, faster. Right? So if we look at, here's our elephant, and it looks like, I don't know, some small organism on it, a mouse, right? Which one has what we say is the higher basal metabolic rate? Well, mouse or an elephant, right? Well, when we look at the metabolic rate per gram of mass, right, we see that the mouse is much higher than the elephant. Which is what we just talked about, right? However, if we were going to look at the metabolic rate of the entire organism, right, the elephant is going to win, right? There's way more metabolizing that's happening in this whole big organism of the elephant than in the mouse, right? But when we look at per gram metabolic rate, we see it much higher in the mouse than the elephant. So that's how they use energy, right, to heat their body a little bit differently. Another thing I want to talk about is just this idea that organisms can gain and lose energy. When we say a net gain, that means an overall we're gaining energy, we're taking in energy. If we have a net gain in energy, we're going to see results of energy storage or growth of an organism, right? In order to grow and expand, that organism has to take in energy in order to be able to use it. If you're having a net loss, that means like an overall, remember net is like overall energy loss. We're going to see a loss in mass, and ultimately you might see a death in that organism, right? Because it doesn't have what it needs to survive. Reproduction. Okay, so different organisms use reproductive strategies based on the energy that's available to them. And there's kind of two different ways in which we see organisms reproduce, okay? They can have lots of offspring at one time. Typically, this is less energy efficient, and it's more common in environments that are sort of unstable, where resources are not always readily available. And it might experience frequent changes. So things like rabbits, fish, maybe bees, bacteria, all good examples of lots of bacteria or lots of, offspring at one time, right? In hopes that they survive. Some of them survive and move on because typically there's not a lot of prenatal care or postnatal care even too, right, of the offspring. Or you can have few offspring, like one or two at a time, not always just one, but definitely in limited numbers. This is actually more energy efficient, and it tends to be more common in stable ecological environments, right? So when we think about humans, right, this is something that humans do, elephants, lots of mammal type organisms that we think about, right? So it's really just two ways in which different organisms can reproduce based on what's available to them as far as resources and energy. Okay, when we also talk about reproduction and how it can be beneficial to organisms, one thing we can talk about is seasonal reproduction in both plants and animals. It can happen at different times of the year based on when is really best and how that organism is responding to its environment. So plants, right? If we think about plants, they produce pollen at times of the year when pollinators will be active. Why is that beneficial, right? It can spread their pollen and you can see more plants grow, right? Animals often reproduce in the spring and the summer when food is more available, right? We think about how things grow. And plants, right? And if we go back to our trophic levels and how everything is supported by one another, that really helps. To support offspring, reproduction can also be triggered by what we call critical lengths of the day. Critical, we call them photoperiods, right? And a photoperiod is just the relative length of day and night to each other. So that's one way for organisms, right, to be able to tell that it might be time to reproduce. An example is grizzly bears. They tend to mate between May and July, right? And females actually delay implantation of their eggs in their uterus until October or November. Successful implantation does not occur when food is limited if the female has not actually accumulated enough fat reserves before hibernation, right? They will not see that implementation happening. And the fertilized egg will just get reabsorbed and will not develop, right? As a way to kind of ensure that the mother has enough energy available, nutrients available in order to see the success of an offspring there. So I hope that was helpful in understanding how organisms use energy and how that influences their kind of daily life processes. Hope you have a great day, and I'll see you soon.